The mirror blinked first, not me. And in that blink I understood that my life had already shifted its weight. I was standing in my childhood hallway, the kind that smells faintly of soap and old memories, holding a dress that wasn't mine but somehow felt like it had been waiting for me longer than I'd been waiting for myself. The house was awake in its usual way. Footsteps upstairs, the clink of bangles, the low hum of a morning song drifting from the kitchen. But inside me, everything had gone very, very quiet. I'd grown up as the only boy between 3 sisters, an accident of math my family joked about endlessly. Our missing girl, my mother used to say with a smile that never quite landed where jokes usually do. I laughed along because that's what you do when laughter keeps things simple. But simplicity has a way of thinning out when you look at it too long. I learned early to read the room, to soften my voice without meaning to linger near the mirror when everyone else had moved on. Mirrors were always honest with me in a way people weren't. They never rushed me. That morning the mirror felt heavier, like it knew something I was still afraid to name. The dress was pale blue, folded neatly over my arm. It had been left on the sofa by mistake, or fate depending on who you ask, and I'd picked it up before my courage had time to vote. I told myself I was just moving it. I told myself a lot of things. But my feet carried me down the hall anyway. Past framed photos of birthdays and weddings, past versions of myself smiling in clothes that never quite fit my shoulders or my heart. I closed my bedroom door softly, as if the house could hear thoughts. The mirror waited. It always did. I didn't put the dress on right away. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands, at the familiar lines and the unfamiliar tremor. I thought about my sisters, how easily they occupied space, how they spoke with their whole faces, how their laughter filled rooms instead of bouncing off walls. I loved them fiercely, and loving them had taught me something dangerous. That belonging could look effortless, that identity could be worn like second skin. The mirror caught my eye again. It reflected a version of me that looked tired of pretending the hallway was just a hallway, and the dress was just a dress. When I finally stood, it felt ceremonial, like crossing a line drawn only for me. The fabric slipped over my shoulders with a softness that startled me. Not excitement, something calmer, deeper. Recognition. My breath hitched not because it was forbidden but because it felt overdue. I didn't spin. I didn't smile. I just stood there, letting the mirror do what mirrors do best. Tell the truth without commentary. I looked like myself. Not the version everyone expected. The quiet one. The extra one. But the one who had always been standing slightly out of frame. A knock on the door shattered the moment. "Breakfast," my sister called, casual and unknowing. The world pressed back in. I stared at my reflection, heart racing, mind splitting into 100 what-ifs. I could change back. I could fold the dress like nothing happened. I'd done that my whole life, folding parts of myself until they fit in drawers no one opened. But something in the mirror had shifted. It wasn't approval or defiance. It was steadiness. "I'll be there," I said, surprised by how my voice sounded. Not higher, just clearer. As I stepped back into the hallway, the house felt the same but I didn't. The mirror at the end of the hall caught me one last time. And for a second I swear it smiled. That was the morning I didn't know I'd started living as the 4th girl in my family. I just knew I couldn't go back to pretending the mirror was lying. Breakfast had always been loud in our house, a choreography of overlapping voices and half-finished sentences, but that morning the noise felt distant, like I was listening through water. I hovered at the doorway, the dress hidden beneath an oversized sweater I'd thrown on at the last second, a compromise between courage and fear. The mirror in the hallway had already seen me. Now I had to decide how much of me the rest of the world would get. My sisters were already seated, hair in various stages of done, arguing about nothing and everything. My mother moved between stove and table with practiced grace, the same rhythm she'd kept for decades. No one looked up right away, and that small mercy gave me time to breathe. I slid into my usual chair, the one at the corner, the one that let me observe without being observed. I perfected that role. "You're quiet today," my eldest sister said, glancing over with a smile that was more curious than concerned. "Didn't sleep much," I replied. It wasn't a lie. I just didn't say why. As I reached for my cup, my sleeve shifted, revealing a hint of pale blue at my wrist. It was nothing, barely a whisper of color, but my heart slammed as if I'd been caught shouting. I waited for someone to notice, to point, to ask. No one did. The world didn't end. The ceiling didn't crack. The mirror across the room, tucked between the cabinet doors, reflected a version of me who was learning something new. Sometimes fear shouts louder than reality. All through breakfast, I felt like I was carrying a secret that hummed under my skin. Every laugh felt sharper, every glance heavier. I wondered how many mornings my sisters had sat at this same table carrying secrets of their own, learning when to speak and when to swallow words whole. The thought made me feel less alone and more exposed at the same time. After breakfast, my mother asked me to help her fold laundry. It was an ordinary request, but my pulse spiked like it was a test. The laundry room was small, warm, and lined with mirrors on the closet doors. Too many reflections, too many angles. As we worked, she talked about errands and neighbors, her voice steady, familiar. I nodded, matched her rhythm, tried not to think about the dress beneath my sweater or the way my body felt different, aligned in a way I hadn't known to ask for. At one point, she handed me a stack of dresses. I froze just for a second. She didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose not to. Our fingers brushed as I took the pile, and the contact sent a strange mix of comfort and fear through me. I folded carefully, smoothing fabric the way she'd taught my sisters, the way I'd watched from the doorway for years. "You're good at this," she said casually. The words landed heavier than they should have. Compliments often did. I wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to ask 1,000 things, but instead I just said, "I've had good teachers." She smiled, and for a moment I wondered if she saw more than I was showing. Later, alone in my room again, I stood in front of the mirror and pulled the sweater off. The dress was still there, still real. I studied my reflection with new eyes, not searching for flaws but for truth. The mirror had become a kind of anchor, a place where I could return to myself when the world felt too loud. I realized then that this wasn't about clothes. It never had been. It was about permission, about letting myself exist without constantly editing the edges. From the hallway, I heard my sisters laughing, calling for me to join them. I hesitated, hand on the door, heart pounding with the weight of what might come next. The mirror didn't blink this time. It just waited. I opened the door before I could talk myself out of it, because hesitation had been my loudest habit for years. The hallway light caught the edge of the dress as I stepped out, not enough to announce anything, just enough to make my pulse spike again. My sisters were sprawled in the living room, legs tucked under them, sharing a phone screen and laughing like the world was kind. That sound had always pulled me in. Today it felt like a test I hadn't studied for. "Come sit," the middle one said, patting the space beside her without looking up. Casual, unceremonious, like I belonged there by default. I sat. The couch dipped, the fabric creaked, and for a moment I was hyper-aware of everything. How I crossed my legs where my hands rested, the way my shoulders softened when I forgot to hold them stiff. No one commented. No one stared. The mirror across the room, half covered by a curtain, caught us all in one frame. 3 sisters and me, close enough that the label almost fit. They talked about clothes first. They always did. An upcoming family event, colors, styles, who was borrowing what. I listened, nodding, adding the occasional comment when I could. I knew more than they realized. Watching had been my unofficial education. When my youngest sister turned to me suddenly and asked, "What do you think?" I felt something inside me leap, fear and excitement tangled together. "I think lighter colors," I said slowly. "They move better. They don't try so hard." All 3 of them looked at me then. Really looked. Not surprised. Not amused. Just attentive. "That's actually really good," the eldest said after a beat. "You notice details." There it was again. That quiet acknowledgement. Not a spotlight, just a door cracking open. As the afternoon stretched on, small things kept happening. One sister handed me a bracelet absent-mindedly while she tied her hair. Another asked me to zip a dress she was trying on, trusting my hands without a second thought. Each moment stacked on the last, building something fragile and brave inside my chest. I felt like I was learning a language I'd always understood but never spoken out loud. Later, when they finally dispersed, I lingered in the living room alone. The house had settled into its afternoon hush, sunlight slanting across the floor. I walked to the mirror and pulled the curtain aside fully this time. The reflection felt fuller now, layered with echoes of laughter and almost questions. I practiced standing the way my sisters did, weight shifted, chin lifted slightly, not apologizing for space. I didn't look like them exactly, and that was okay. The thought surprised me with how gentle it felt. That evening, as we all gathered again for tea, my mother watched me longer than usual. Not sharply, thoughtfully. Her gaze flicked to the bracelet still on my wrist, then back to my face. I braced myself, rehearsed explanations I wasn't ready to give. She said nothing. Instead, she placed a cup in front of me, same as always, and asked if I wanted sugar. The ordinary kindness of it nearly undid me. Sometimes acceptance doesn't arrive as a speech. Sometimes it comes disguised as routine. That night, back in my room, I stood before the mirror and finally let myself smile. It was small, unsure, but real. The mirror held it carefully like a promise. I wasn't out. I wasn't declared. But something had shifted in the way the house breathed around me, and in the way I breathed inside it. And for the first time, the idea of being the fourth girl didn't feel like a secret. Felt like a direction. That night, sleep came in fragments, stitched together by thoughts that refused to stay still. Every time I closed my eyes, the mirror appeared again. Not accusing, not approving, just present. I kept replaying the small moments from the day, the way my sister hadn't hesitated to hand me that bracelet, the way my mother's silence had felt louder than words. Silence can be a wall, but it can also be a bridge. I didn't know yet which one it was. Morning arrived with a soft knock and the sound of my youngest sister's voice. "Can I come in?" I sat up too quickly, heart racing, then remembered there was nothing to hide. The dress from yesterday was folded neatly on the chair, visible, undeniable. When she opened the door, her eyes flicked to it for half a second, long enough for me to notice, not long enough to feel judged. "That's pretty," she said simply, stepping inside like she always did, barefoot and unafraid. She started talking about her day, about school and a friend who'd said something silly, and the world kept spinning. I nodded, listened, tried not to read too much into the fact that she hadn't lowered her voice or changed her tone. To her, this was just another version of me in the room. As she left, she paused. "You know," she added, almost as an afterthought, "you don't have to rush. About anything." Then she was gone, door clicking softly behind her. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty doorway. My sisters had always been ahead of me, older, bolder, more certain. But maybe they'd been waiting too, in their own way, for me to catch up to myself. Later that day, my eldest sister asked if I wanted to help her get ready for an outing. The question was casual, but it landed like an invitation I'd been rehearsing for years. We stood together in her room, surrounded by familiar chaos. Scarves draped over chairs, makeup scattered like possibilities across the dresser. She handed me a brush and turned her back without ceremony. "Tell me if I'm overthinking this," she said, talking into the mirror. "Does this look like me, or am I trying too hard?" I caught her reflection, caught my own beside it. Two faces, different stories, sharing the same glass. "It looks like you," I said. "On a day you feel brave." She smiled at that, really smiled, and something in my chest loosened. As I watched her leave, confident and put together, I realized the mirror was changing again. It was no longer just a place where I checked myself in secret. It was becoming a shared space, a witness to small truths unfolding in daylight. That evening, alone once more, I stood before it and tried something new. I spoke out loud, not a declaration, not a label, just a sentence I needed to hear. "I'm allowed to take my time." The mirror didn't answer, but it didn't need to. For the first time, the reflection felt patient. Outside my room, the house hummed with familiar life, and I felt myself leaning toward it instead of away. Being the fourth girl wasn't a costume I put on and took off. It was a slow, careful alignment, one moment, one breath at a time. And tomorrow, I knew, would ask a little more of me. Tomorrow arrived wearing courage I hadn't packed for, disguised as a simple family errand. My mother announced over breakfast that we were all going shopping together, the way she used to when we were younger, before schedules and silences complicated things. The word all hung in the air, and I felt it settle on me like a question mark. Shopping had always been my favorite thing to avoid. Too many mirrors. Too many reflections that didn't agree on who I was supposed to be. I'd perfected the art of standing near exits, of holding bags instead of opinions. But this time something was different. The mirror in the hallway caught me adjusting my sleeves before we left. A small, deliberate movement. Felt like a quiet decision. At the mall, my sisters scattered with instinctive ease, already debating stores and colors. I followed, half a step behind, the familiar rhythm of the extra one. But then my eldest sister slowed until we were walking side by side. "You don't have to disappear," she said softly, eyes forward, as if commenting on the floor tiles. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. I swallowed. "I know. I just don't want to make it weird." She stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "You're not making anything weird. You're just being present." Present. The word echoed as we stepped into a clothing store flooded with light and mirrors. My chest tightened automatically, old reflexes flaring. Racks of dresses stretched out like questions I wasn't sure I was allowed to answer. I hovered near the entrance, fingers brushing fabric without committing. My youngest sister noticed. She grabbed a dress, soft, neutral, unassuming, and held it up against me without ceremony. "This would suit you," she said, like she was stating the weather. Time slowed. I waited for laughter, for backtracking, for someone to say just kidding. It didn't happen. "I don't know," I said, defaulting to safety. "You don't have to know," my middle sister added. "Just try." The fitting room mirror was merciless and kind in equal measure. As I slipped the dress on, my hands shook, not from fear of how I'd look, but from the realization that I was being seen, really seen, before I was ready to explain myself. When I finally turned toward the mirror, breath caught in my throat. The reflection wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished or styled, but it was honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. I looked like someone learning how to stand in their own outline. When I stepped out, my sisters didn't clap or cheer. They just nodded, smiles soft, eyes warm. "Yeah," the eldest said. "That's you." The simplicity of it broke something open inside me. No speeches. No labels. Just recognition. On the way home, bags rustling at our feet, I stared out the window and watched my reflection slide across the glass, layered over the passing city. For once, it didn't feel like it was trying to escape. That night, back in my room, I hung the new dress carefully in the closet, not hidden, not displayed, just placed. The mirror caught the movement, and I realized the object had changed again. It wasn't just reflecting who I was. It was remembering who I was becoming. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning of the harder questions. The harder questions didn't arrive all at once. They came quietly, disguised as ordinary moments that asked me to choose where to sit, what to wear, how to introduce myself when relatives called. Each choice felt small on its own, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The mirror noticed before I did. It always did. A family gathering was announced midweek, the kind that came with too much food and too many opinions. The news tightened something in my chest. Extended family meant old labels, old jokes, the version of me they remembered because it was easier than updating the picture. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, weighing outfits like they were answers to questions no one had asked yet. My middle sister knocked and leaned against the doorframe, watching me think. "You're spiraling," she said gently. "I'm preparing," I replied, but we both knew the difference. She crossed the room and adjusted the scarf I draped over the chair, looping it with an ease I envied. "You don't owe anyone a performance," she said. "You're not here to convince them." The words settled slowly. I repeated them silently while getting dressed the next day, while tying my shoes, while breathing through the familiar knot of nerves. When we arrived, the house buzzed with voices and clattering dishes. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and felt the old instinct to shrink tug at me hard. A few glances lingered longer than others. Someone asked a question and corrected themselves halfway through. Each moment stung, but none of them shattered me. My sisters stayed close without crowding, a quiet wall of familiarity. My mother moved through the room like an anchor, steady and unflinching. At one point, I caught my reflection in a glass cabinet, my posture straighter than I remembered, my expression calmer. The mirror motif had followed me here too, just in a new disguise. I realized I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I was practicing endurance. Later, as we drove home under a sky gone soft with evening, exhaustion washed over me, followed by something lighter. Pride maybe. Not loud. Earned. Back in my room, I stood before the mirror one last time that night. I looked tired. I looked real. The mirror held both without judgment. I touched the glass lightly, not to check, but to acknowledge. I was still learning. Still afraid sometimes. Still me. And for the first time that felt like enough. I didn't realize how much energy I'd been spending on survival until a day arrived that felt ordinary. No inner alarms, no rehearsed explanations, no constant scanning for reactions. It startled me more than fear ever had. The mirror that morning showed a version of me that looked rested, almost unfamiliar in its ease. It happened on a weekday, the house quieter than usual. My sisters had drifted into their routines, and I found myself helping my mother in the kitchen again, moving in sync without thinking. She handed me a bowl, I reached for spices, our movements overlapping like they always had. The difference was subtle but profound. I wasn't performing calm. I was calm. "You seem lighter," she said suddenly, not looking at me. I froze then softened. "I feel lighter." She nodded, as if that answered everything she needed to know. We didn't say more. Some conversations don't need an audience or a conclusion. Later, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. No dress this time, just comfortable clothes that felt chosen instead of assigned. The mirror motif had evolved again. It wasn't about transformation anymore. It was about continuity. That afternoon, my sisters invited me to sit with them while they sorted through old photos. Albums opened, memories spilling out in glossy squares. We laughed at outdated hairstyles, teased each other gently, shared stories I'd half forgotten. Then my youngest sister paused at a photo of us as kids. "Remember this day?" she asked. I did. I remembered standing just out of frame, holding someone's jacket, unsure where to put my hands. Seeing it now, I felt a quiet ache. Not regret exactly, but compassion for the person I'd been. "I wish I'd told you sooner," I said, surprising myself. They all looked up. "Told us what?" my eldest asked. "That I was figuring things out," I said carefully. "That I needed time." She closed the album slowly. "You're telling us now," she said. "That counts." The mirror that night reflected a house filled with soft laughter drifting down the hall. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the sound sink in, letting the reflection blur slightly as my eyes watered. Not from sadness, from release. Being the fourth girl wasn't about replacing anything. It was about adding myself back into the picture. And for the first time, the mirror didn't feel like a witness. Felt like a companion. The companion phase didn't last without being tested. Growth rarely goes unchallenged, it just chooses quieter battlegrounds. Mine arrived in the form of the outside world. The one that didn't share my family's shorthand or their patience. A friend from years ago messaged me unexpectedly, suggesting we meet up. Someone who remembered me as I had been, not as I was becoming. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I meant to, turning the phone over in my hands like it might answer for me. The reflection looked back, steady but alert, like it knew this moment mattered. This wasn't about clothes or pronouns or explanations. It was about whether I could carry myself beyond the safety of familiar walls. I agreed to meet. The cafe was loud and bright, all glass and movement. I arrived early, chose a seat near the window, and watched my reflection merge with the street outside. Faces passing through me, then gone. When my friend arrived, there was a flicker of surprise that he tried to hide. We hugged awkwardly, sat down, ordered coffee. "So," he said after a pause, smiling too quickly, "you've changed." I nodded. "I've grown." The conversation stumbled at first, old jokes landing unevenly, shared memories brushing against new boundaries. I felt the urge to soften myself, to translate, to make it easier for him. The mirror in the cafe window caught my eye, and I remembered my sister's words. "You don't owe anyone a performance." "I'm still me," I said calmly. "Just more honest." Something shifted then. Not perfect understanding, not instant acceptance, but respect. We talked. Really talked. And when we parted, it wasn't with confusion or pity, but with a quiet acknowledgement that people don't always stay the same, and that's not a failure. Walking home, I felt taller. Not because everything had gone smoothly, but because I'd stayed. That night, the mirror reflected someone who had stepped outside and come back intact. The fourth girl wasn't just a role within my family anymore. She was learning how to exist in the wider world, one conversation at a time. And I knew there were still harder days ahead, but fewer shadows. The fewer shadows didn't mean there was no darkness left. It just meant I could see it coming now. The next test arrived quietly, disguised as paperwork and phone calls, The kind of adult logistics that force you to choose which version of yourself shows up on forms and in offices. Names, titles, checkboxes that never quite ask the right questions. I sat at my desk with the mirror angled just enough to catch my face while I worked. Not to judge, just to ground myself. Every time I hesitated, I looked up. The reflection didn't rush me. It reminded me that I wasn't betraying my past by telling the truth about my present. One afternoon, my father came home earlier than usual. He'd always been the quiet center of the house, steady and reserved, someone whose approval I'd learned to seek silently. We'd spoken kindly, comfortably, but never deeply about me. When he asked if I wanted tea, my chest tightened for reasons I couldn't explain. We sat together in the living room, the TV muted, the air filled with the hum of the ceiling fan. I caught our reflections in the dark screen. Two silhouettes sharing a space. He glanced at me, then away, then back again. "You seem more yourself lately," he said carefully. I felt the words before I understood them. "I'm trying to be," I replied. He nodded slowly. "That's good. It's a hard thing being honest with yourself." That was all. No interrogation. No warning. Just a sentence that felt like a hand resting briefly on my shoulder. When he stood to leave, the room felt larger, lighter. That night, alone again, I stood in front of the mirror and realized something new. The object that had once frightened me, then guided me, was becoming unnecessary. Not gone, just quieter. I wasn't checking anymore. I was confirming. Living as the fourth girl wasn't about constant proof. It was about consistency. And consistency, I was learning, could be powerful. Consistency changed the way time moved. Days stopped feeling like obstacles and started feeling like space, room to stretch, to settle into myself without bracing for impact. The mirror still greeted me each morning, but now it felt less like a checkpoint and more like a familiar face on a quiet street. We nodded at each other. We carried on. One evening, my sisters were getting ready for a small celebration. Nothing formal, just friends and food and laughter spilling out of the living room. I hovered in my doorway, half-dressed, caught between old instincts and new confidence. The mirror caught my hesitation immediately. I exhaled, adjusted my hair, and stepped out. My sisters turned as one. Not dramatically, just enough to register me fully. "There you are," my middle sister said, like I'd been late, not brave. That word there wrapped around me. Not oh, not wow. Just there. Present. Expected. Throughout the evening, I moved through the room without shrinking. Conversations rose and fell around me. Someone asked my opinion and waited for it. Someone else laughed at something I said and meant it. I caught my reflection in a window again, layered with lights and movement, and felt a quiet swell of pride. Not because I was seen, but because I wasn't hiding. Later, when the house finally settled and the echoes faded, I returned to my room and stood in front of the mirror one last time that night. I didn't pose. I didn't analyze. I just stood there, breathing, existing. I realized then that the mirror's role had changed completely. It wasn't where I went to become someone else. It was where I went to remember that I already was. Living as the fourth girl wasn't a reveal or a reveal's aftermath. It was a rhythm I'd learned, a balance I kept choosing. Some days would still wobble. Some days would sting. But the core of me felt steady now, anchored in truth instead of fear. I turned off the light and let the room go dark, carrying that steadiness with me. And I knew the final step wasn't about proving anything at all. It was about letting the story continue. The final steps didn't announce themselves with ceremony. They arrived disguised as confidence, so quiet it almost felt like nothing at all. I noticed it one morning when I left the house without checking the mirror twice. I still glanced, of course, I always would, but I didn't negotiate with my reflection anymore. I trusted it. A neighbor greeted me by name that day, the same tone they used with my sisters, easy and unremarkable. We talked about the weather, about nothing, about everything that didn't matter. And somehow that was the point. I walked away feeling lighter than I ever had after a big moment. Normalcy, it turns out, can be revolutionary. That afternoon, I helped my youngest sister practice for a presentation. She paced, nervous, stumbling over words. I listened, offered suggestions, reassured her without thinking. Halfway through, she stopped and smiled at me. "You're really good at this," she said. "You make things feel safer." The word stayed with me long after she left. Safer. I stood in front of the mirror later, repeating it quietly. testing how it felt in my mouth. The reflection didn't change, but I did. I saw someone who had walked through fear and come out softer instead of harder. That evening, I sat with my sisters on the roof, watching the city dim into evening. Someone played music softly on their phone, a familiar song we'd all grown up with. The sound wrapped around us, and for a moment time folded in on itself. Past, present, possibility all breathing together. I thought about the person I'd been, standing in hallways, holding pieces of myself like fragile glass. I thought about how far I'd come without ever really leaving home. Living as the fourth girl hadn't erased anything. It had gathered everything back into one place. When I went to bed that night, the mirror caught me one last time, framed by lamplight. I met my own eyes without flinching. Tomorrow would come. Life would keep asking questions. But I finally trusted myself to answer them, out loud or quietly as needed. The story wasn't ending. It was settling into itself. The last thing that changed wasn't how I dressed or how I spoke or where I stood in rooms. It was how I remembered myself. One quiet afternoon, I opened an old box in my closet, photos, school notebooks, things I'd packed away because they felt like artifacts from a life I'd outgrown. I expected distance. What I felt instead was tenderness. I spread the memories across my bed and let myself look without flinching. There I was, younger, uncertain, doing the best I could with the language I had at the time. I realized then that becoming the fourth girl in my family hadn't erased that person. It had protected them. It had carried them forward. I walked to the mirror one last time that day, not out of habit, not out of need, but out of gratitude. The reflection looked back, familiar and calm. Not finished. Not perfect. But whole. From the hallway, I heard my sisters calling for me. The way they always did now, without hesitation, without adjustment. I answered without thinking, my voice steady, my steps unmeasured. As I joined them, laughter folding me in, I felt something settle permanently into place. I wasn't living as the fourth girl anymore. I was living, and the mirror finally could rest.